Morning, everyone. I am Daniel Schrader. I am the director of the Center for Jewish Studies and professor of history at the University of Minnesota. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Center for Jewish Studies Community Lecture series. Tonight we will be hearing Professor Laura Lieber, who will be speaking on the subject of Memory's Mirror, seeing ourselves in the Book of Esther. Great timing for the topic, coming just 2 days before Purim. I would like to thank Minnesota Hillel, our virtual co-hosts of our lecture this evening. Our lecture series, which is now in its 19th year, brings Jewish studies to the larger community, and we're very grateful for our partnership with the many off-campus venues that have hosted our lectures. So we hope we'll have another opportunity for Minnesota Hillel to host our host a lecture in person in the future. I also want to thank our University of Minnesota co-sponsors, the Classical and Near Eastern Religions and Culture, and the program in Religious Studies. And we are forever grateful for the gift and memory of Julia Kay and Harold Segal in support of our lecture series, and special thanks to all the tireless work of my colleagues, Natan Paradise, the Associate Director of the Center, and Mario Koter, our Outreach and Program Coordinator, both of whom, without them, these events would not be possible. Following tonight's lecture, we hope that you will be able to join us for our last lecture in this year's community lecture series with musicologist Edwin Sarusi at Mount Zion Temple on Wednesday, March 30th. So it is now my great honor to introduce Laura Lieber, professor of religious studies and classical studies. She is also the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Duke University. She received a rabbinical ordination from Hebrew Union College and her doctorate from the University of Minnesota. Professor Lieber is the author of many books and articles on a very wide range of topics. Among her specializations are the subject of liturgical poetry, or Piyyut, in late antiquity, which she studies from many different angles, I would say, and with much, I think, even more contemporary resonance, I think, from, as we'll hear this evening. She is the author of 5 books, I should say 5 books either published or forthcoming, most recently Jewish Aramaic Poetry from Late Antiquity, another one that is due to come out any moment, Classical Samaritan Poetry, and she has a forthcoming work to be published with Oxford University Press, Staging the Sacred Performance in Late Ancient Liturgical Poetry. I also would like to invite you to join us for a virtual on-campus colloquium tomorrow at 4 p.m., again with Laura Lieber. We'll be giving a talk on Isaac Unbound Transformations of Genesis 22 in Late Antiquity, which will be, again, 4 p.m. tomorrow. I'm sorry, I don't have the link in front of me, but you can join us virtually for that tomorrow. Finally, during and following the lecture, please submit your questions and comments to Professor Lieber in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So it's now my pleasure to turn this over to Professor Lieber. Laura, it's yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here virtually, and I guess I think there are a few people I know who can be here because we're on Zoom, who couldn't be here if I were in person. So trying to look at the sweet as well as the bittersweet aspects of not being with you on campus or at the Hillel this evening. And yes, this topic was chosen with the calendar in mind, with the approaching holiday of Purim, where the Book of Esther is read. And part of the reason why and what I was thinking of when I put this talk together that I'm about to share is I'm interested in liturgical poetry, which often can seem like a very obscure field of research. It can seem it's much less familiar than the church fathers or the rabbis or the important canonical sources that are usually encountered when we're in graduate school. But the liturgical poetry in the Hebrew Piyyutim were really, in a lot of ways, the popular literature, the popular performance of their time in a religious venue. And the Book of Esther in particular has a really rich history of popular performance, which is what I wanted to look at for tonight. It'll help us see the deep roots of what many congregations will be doing just later this week. So I'm going to share my screen. And what I'm going to do tonight is walk you through the history of performance of the Book of Esther in various ways. So my field is very much late antiquity. And so here, even on this opening slide, that's a mask. It's a Persian mask from a Persian theater performance. It's a mask for a king, probably from a theatrical performance after the death of the last Persian king before the Muslim conquest. So it's a 7th century Persian mask. So it sets us in some ways in the context of the Book of Esther in Persia. But every generation has made the Book of Esther its own. So we're going to look at how, not just sort of the story of Esther, but really how the story of Esther was experienced and encountered by primarily Jews in a variety of centuries, from the time when it was first written, from the earliest evidence we have in the Hebrew Bible up to pretty much the present day. So it's a sort of it's an aerial view in some ways, but we'll get enough specifics that I think you'll be able to connect the dots with me. In looking at performance, one of the things that stands out about Esther in the Hebrew Bible, this is the earliest version of the story that we have, is the way in it's, as I put it here, it's a tight script with a specific purpose, in that every chapter very specifically sort of sets a stage and introduces key figures. And it's really very easy to imagine the staging of the events as it's taking place. It's a very vivid book. It's very interested in details about, who's wearing what and how things are decorated. And, the clothing that it stresses becomes important in the medieval period and in the early modern period, and the costumes and the fancy dress balls that we'll see. But the characters are very clear. There's a sort of a senior, there's sort of a senior advisor in the form of Mordecai. There's a king. There's a sort of a buffoon of a king, a wicked queen or a misunderstood queen in the form of Vashti. There's the wise patriarch Mordecai and his beautiful younger cousin Esther, who infiltrates the harem. So it has everything you could really want from an exciting story. It has mystery, intrigue, plots against the king's life, plots against the Jews. And here in chapter 5 and chapter 7, these pivotal banquet scenes, which have sort of the intimacy of, you imagine the three figures of Esther and the king and the wicked Haman, who is plotting against the Jews, all seated around, a central table of some form. And you have the dramatic rise and fall of Haman, and the rise and further rise of Mordecai, on behalf of the Jews. And it's really this fantastical story, but it's a very satisfying novella, and it's really very funny in many ways also, which is certainly part of its appeal and is part of its problem as well. It's also, I should note, the one book that has still never been attested to among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was probably not part of the canon of the pietists at Qumran, we can hypothesize various reasons, but it was not part of that canon. And it was, as we'll see, there's a long tradition of regarding the Book of Esther as needing some improvement, perhaps in some way. But in terms of understanding the drama and sort of the rhetorical power of the Book of Esther, I have here just a few verses from, this is just the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament Book of Esther, and it just gives you a sense. So this is from the climactic scene in the banquet, which I have an illustration by the artist Ernst Normand, who dramatizes it. So Queen Esther replied, she's revealing here the conspiracy against the Jews. If your majesty will do me the favor, and if it pleases your majesty, let my life be granted to me as my wish. He's offered her anything she wants, up to half the kingdom. Let my life be granted to me and my people as my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, massacred, and exterminated. Had we only been sold as bondsmen and bondswomen, I would have kept silent, for a trifle is not worthy of the king's trouble. So just you can see here sort of the power of her rhetoric and her oratory and the way she uses spoken words to appeal to the king. And it's very effective because King Ahasuerus, the buffoonish Persian king, demands, who is he and where is he who's dared to do this? And she says, the adversary and enemy is this evil Haman. And I've underlined in boldface the pronoun, which as you see in the picture, she's pointing, because for the rabbis later, the word this is always understood to indicate a gesture. So she's pointing at Haman, and Haman cringed in terror before the king and the queen. The king, furious, storms out. Haman tries to plead with the queen for his life, and so he throws himself on her lap, and when the king walks in at just the right or wrong moment, depending on your perspective, he assumes that Haman is attempting to ravish the queen in his own palace. So anyway, I think this gives a nice little example of the drama that's implicit in the biblical text as it was received. The problem, we might say, that certain or other audiences have had with the Hebrew version of the Book of Esther is it's most famous perhaps for the fact that it never mentions God. The rabbis and others found ways of reading God into the story, but certainly compared to figures such as Daniel or Ezra and Nehemiah, other late books of the Hebrew Bible, it is a remarkably secular book, we could say. That Esther, it actually sort of walks up to the line where you expect piety of some kind, and then it veers away. And what we see in the Greek version of Esther that's preserved in the Septuagint is that Esther is translated into Greek, and along the way, as I would say, sort of translated and improved, borrowing from a famous Yiddish take on Shakespeare, when Shakespeare was translated into Yiddish, and the apocryphal posters that described Hamlet translated and improved. So we have a number of additions in the Greek version, which expand and contextualize and in some ways sort of normalize, certainly by Hellenistic Jewish standards, the Book of Esther. So it's given this, Mordecai has this dream, vision, prophecy of two dragons fighting, which opens the text, and at the very end, sort of a nice chiastic structure that at the end of the book, Mordecai explains his dream, and there's even a little colophon explaining the apparently the cataloging of the book. And then it has expansions such as the text of the king's letter. The Hebrew version just says that the king sent the letter. So edition B tells us the text. Most importantly, in edition C and D, we're given prayers uttered by Mordecai and Esther. So they're made into pious Jews in the Hellenistic model in terms of the content of their prayers and their entreaties of God. So it reads God into the story. And then the dramatic expansion of Esther's appearance before Ahasuerus, the buffoonish king, who is really not quite so much a buffoon in this, as we will see in the later interpretations, that that Esther's entrance is dramatized, and sort of her femininity is brought into what one would expect of the heroine of a more sort of Hellenistic novella, as this Greek version of Esther really transforms the Hebrew version. And here we have an illustration by Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the female painters of the Renaissance, dramatizing Esther, because she, as we will see, in the Greek version, her entrance, her presence before the king is quite expanded. Just to give you a sense of when I say expanded, what I mean here, sort of in terms of the additions in the Greek. In the Hebrew Bible, in the Masoretic text, we are told, on the third day, after fasting for 3 days, Esther put on royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, facing the king's palace while the king was on his royal throne facing the entrance. So it gives you sort of staging directions, as it were. You understand where everyone's looking and how they're oriented. As soon as the king saw Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. He sees her, he's happy. The king extended to Esther the golden scepter that he had in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip. So despite the fact that Persian law, we're told, was that anyone who entered the king's throne room unbidden was liable to be executed, the king instead welcomes her. That's the Hebrew version. In the Greek version, we have a very expanded version. On the third day, after she finished her prayer in the previous edition, we're told she changed clothes out of what she'd been worshiping in, and then she put on her royal clothes. She invokes the aid of the all-seeing God and Savior, and she also, we are told, takes her 2 maids with her, leaning on them. She is radiant in perfect beauty and happy as if beloved, but she's really quite scared. Then we're told how the king looked, sort of his clothes too. And we're also told that he was terrifying. The queen then falters, turns pale, and faints and collapses up top one of the maid who was going in front of her. And God changed the spirit of the king to gentleness. And in alarm, he springs up from the throne, takes her up in his arms, and then, rouses her so that she comes to herself, and then speaks to her very gently. What is it, Esther? I am your husband. Take courage, you shall not die. For our law applies only to our subjects. Come near. Then he embraces her and says, speak to me again. And she starts to speak, but then she faints again. So she's really quite a different figure in terms of her demeanor before the king. In some ways, we could say here that she is perhaps one of the first actresses in biblical tradition. So that's where we are with sort of the canonical versions of the Book of Esther. The Hebrew version, which is part of the Jewish Bible and therefore becomes part of the Protestant scriptures, and then the Greek version, which remains part of the canon in Catholic and Orthodox communities, which will help explain why Renaissance painters who appear throughout this presentation often depict these scenes, especially of Esther fainting before King Ahasuerus. Now, because of the association with the holiday of Purim, the Book of Esther and the stories of Esther become important parts of synagogue tradition as well. And this is where we're going to briefly visit the world that is my research specialty. I'll be speaking more specifically and at length about liturgical poetry tomorrow. But today I certainly want to look at the world, at how Esther was presented in synagogue literatures. Now, I'm not going to read this whole text for you, but this is a complete poem. It's in Jewish Aramaic poetry. It's in Jewish Aramaic language. So it's from around the 4th to 7th century. We don't really know more precisely than that. And what I want you to notice here is that this poem in Aramaic, this is the complete work, is written in the voice of a very minor character. It's written in the voice of Zeresh, who is the wife of Haman, the wicked counselor to the king. And it is written in the voice of Zeresh after she has witnessed her husband and her 10 sons be executed for their role in the plot against the Jews. And what I want you to notice about this poem that really stands out is not just that it's in the voice of a minor character, that some poet looking at the Book of Esther and thinking, what am I going to do with this for this year at Purim, hit upon the idea of expanding the persona of this minor character and using her as a way to retell much of the story. Also does it not as narrative, but very much in the character of Zeresh. in that most of the poem is actually in her voice. It's direct speech. It's not narrative about her, just the opening lines where it tells you that, you know, when they were crucified, those 10 sons of Haman, Zeresh wailed and cried out. And she condemns her husband. Woe, O unjust Haman, who set a snare for us. She's a victim of his plot as well. Every year, all the time, they say, cursed is Haman, and there it evokes a common phrase in the celebrations of Purim. So we see here the way that this poem, it plays on the familiar practices of the synagogue in terms of the celebration of Purim, the fact that whenever Haman's name is said, people tend to shout and make noises and stamp their feet as a way of fulfilling the commandment to blot out his name. And so so Zeresh in this poem is reflecting that custom. And then we have a refrain where you can imagine the community even joining in some way in her lament. Now, this is not a poem that many of us would like, and it's certainly not one that we said in a synagogue today, because it's not in a very generous spirit. It's really takes some pleasure in the grief of the wife of the enemy. And in fact, she dies at the end of the poem, which this picks up on a tradition that we see in more scholarly literature from the time, the rabbinic interpretations of the Book of Esther. But here it is being set in poetry, and it's really quite carnivalesque, we could say, which is common for the holiday of Purim. So, and you can just, I can share the text with anyone who is particularly interested in this, but that we see her picture of grief. And one idea is that in some ways, this is a Jewish take on reflecting their familiarity with Christian customs of the time in terms of the grief of Mary at the crucifixion, because again, Purim often falls quite near Easter, which is a time of interreligious tension. And this is, I think you could say, Jews being pretty naughty in terms of their expressing sentiments in the synagogue that they certainly would not be able to express outside. And here, this is an image from the Leipzig Machzor, which is a German 14th century, so a good 7 centuries or so after the poem. And I show it to you because you see here a graphic, an illumination which depicts Haman and his 10 sons who have been hung from the gallows that Haman built for the Jews, built for Mordecai and the Jews. So there's an irony of he intended to hang Mordecai and the Jews, and instead he got hung on his own gallows. So sort of a version of hoist on his own petard. And it's actually this illumination, I give you a close-up of it, is there's a tradition in Midrash that this picture alludes to, which is that Haman's daughter, because there's a scene in chapter 5 where Haman is forced to lead Mordecai the Jew around, Mordecai is dressed in the king's regalia and rides the king's own horse and is celebrated, and Haman has to lead him through the town, and it's sort of humiliation for Haman, because Haman thought he was describing his own reward and not a reward that be given to Mordecai. So we have Haman leading the horse, and Mordecai, he has his little Jew hat there that the German Jews would have had to wear in the Middle Ages as part of the sumptuary laws to indicate their Jewishness. But he also has on the king's crown because he's wearing the king's regalia. And this is Haman's daughter, who is depicted as emptying a chamber pot on what she thinks is Mordecai, but is actually her father. So she dumps a chamber, which is really quite a good throw there in terms of the picture. But so on top of everything else, Haman gets a chamber pot emptied on his head, and by his own daughter, because she thought she was helping him humiliate Mordecai the Jew, but it just instead humiliated her father more. And there at the bottom of the tree, you see Zeresh, the speaker of the poem that I just shared with you from Antiquity, from Late Antiquity. Here Zeresh is mourning her husband and her 10 sons. So this is an illumination from a medieval prayer book that reflects some of the same traditions that we've been talking about. We also have liturgical poems for this case, it's a text for Shabbat Zachor, which is the Shabbat we just celebrated, is the Shabbat immediately preceding Purim. And here, I'm not going to go into this text in any detail, but I just want you to see part of what makes this text interesting to me is it's a poet who was known as a name on a list, but we did not actually have any of his works until the 20th century when he was recovered from the Cairo Geniza, which you may have heard about. That would be subject of a separate lecture. But what we see here is this is the image is a picture. It's the Yannai text. So it's a poem in Hebrew that's written over a passage from the New Testament, actually, which is in Christian Palestinian Aramaic. So the parchment was reused. It's a palimpsest. The parchment, which had the New Testament on it, was scraped clean and reused by Jews, which itself is a very interesting topic to consider. And most scholars were originally interested in figuring out what the undertext was, what had been erased, and identifying that as the Christian Aramaic text. And it was only much later in the history of Cairo Geniza, really in the 1920s and later, that people started paying attention to the overtext, the more clear and legible text of the fragment, and realized that they had a number of works by this poet Yannai, whose works had been lost. Now, in terms of Esther, only the final portions of this poem have been preserved. And they're interesting, but I'm not going to go into detail in them here because of time. But what I want you to see is really, again, the fact that it's a dynamic and experiential portion of the poem, and that it's very focused on engaging the community in participation in the poem, and not just sort of hearing a story, but rather in a sort of becoming part of the story, as it were. So here I've just translated a few excerpts for you of this text, which I don't think otherwise is available in translation. And so it begins with this, again, the formal part. So the enemy whose letters led to lamentations, which referring to Haman, thought there is no God in his heart. And then this is sort of a daisy chain because the last word of one line becomes the first word of the next. So Belibo in his heart. Belibo in his heart, he sought to terrorize the blessed children at the height of his arrogance. So Haman and his ego and his wickedness are the subject of that poem. And the people, I think, would find the rhythm and the patterning of the poem very appealing. And it's helping them get excited about the liturgical moment that they're about to join in. And then the next poem is also very formally patterned in ways that people would be able to anticipate parts of it and chime in, or at least whether chime in physically through joining their voices in, or in terms of just anticipating where the poet is going and enjoying that sense of the formalism of the poetry as well as the words. The content is fairly repetitive. What is attractive to ancient listeners about these works is in fact the aesthetics and the experience of hearing them. In poem 8, because these originally had 9 units, it begins to transition to the portion of the liturgy of the prayer known as the Kedusha, the threefold repetition of holy, holy, holy is the eternal one of hosts, which is the climax of this poem and of most of Yannai's poetry. And the quotation is from Isaiah 6:3, which is something that is an important part of the liturgy to the present day. It has become an important part of Christian liturgy as well, the Sanctus or the Trisagion, the thrice holy in Greek. And it's because these are the words that the prophet Isaiah heard up in heaven, and they're understood to be angelic prayer. And so when the humans of the congregations were looking for good words to pray, the words of the angelic liturgy proved to be very appealing in antiquity. And so we see in poem 9 the way the poet weaves together the biblical language of holy, holy, holy is the eternal one of hosts, the whole earth is filled with his glory. And then he integrates that into the story of Esther and the backstory of Esther and Haman as being the reading them back into the passage in Deuteronomy, which is read on Shabbat Zachor about Amalek, because Haman is a descendant of Amalek and so the eternal enemy of the Jews. I realize I'm going very quickly because, as I said, this is sort of millennia of history. Finally, we have the Aramaic translations. So we've had the liturgical poetry in Aramaic and Hebrew, and then we also have the translations of Esther. And there are two translations that are really extant. And they were so popular that actually what you see here is this is actually a Judeo-Arabic translation, a Judeo-Persian rather, sorry, Judeo-Persian translation of the Aramaic translation of the Book of Esther. So which Esther and the Song of Songs are the two books in which the translations are really that important in their own right for all the ways that they deviate from the text. They were important, popular ways of understanding. And both the two Targums that are extant, and Targum just means Aramaic translation, like the Greek version of Esther, add significant details to the text that are absent from the Hebrew original, and they go far beyond even what we see in the Greek. And I would say they deepen the backstories, they expand the conflicts, they amplify speeches, and I would say they even intensify the drama and the humor. And we'll see an example of that in a moment. So just as a quick case study, what do I mean when I say the Targums expand? Here I have from the Book of Esther, chapter 3, verse 8. So it's just one verse from the Hebrew, and it's Haman's accusation against the Jews, what he says to the king to get the king to condemn all the Jews to extermination. Haman then said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It's not worthwhile for the king to tolerate them." So that's sort of that's the accusation. We see in the first Targum, the slightly less expansive one, that the accusations are expanded. So they acknowledge they have their own laws, but our bread and our cooked dishes they do not eat. Our wine they do not drink. Our festivals they do not celebrate, and our customs they do not observe. So it sort of gets more into the nitty-gritty, and actually through this we can see some of the places where there was presumably friction between Jews and Gentiles in the period when this text was composed, probably around the 6th or 7th century. What was it that upset the non-Jews in the mind of the author of this Targum? It was a failure to eat together, drink together, and to not celebrate the same holidays. They were always kicking up a fuss about the office Christmas party. In terms of the second Targum, I can't even fit on one slide the expansion that this Targum has of this one verse from the Book of Esther. And I will not even try to read to you all the parts that I've underlined, but you can get a sense from just looking at it. When they see us, they spit on the ground. They do not intermarry with us. They are always saying it's a holiday and they can't work, which this always makes me laugh because anyone who survived working with Jewish studies in the month of September probably feels like everyone thinks that about Jews. So they're always saying they can't work because we have to pray, it's a holiday, whatever. And then in the 7th hour, when you think you finally get the Jews to do some work for you, their wives come over and say, "We brought you a dish of beans. It must be so hard for you to be working for the wicked king." There's really something about that strikes me almost as kind of vaudeville. But in any case, you can see how they're integrating parts of their daily lives and what they were hearing, sort of their own self-awareness about the difficulty of being a minority population amidst a majority that is often hostile. And just in terms of closing out our survey of late antiquity here, I just wanted to point out that while we don't have much in the way of the sort of depictions of Esther from late antiquity in the synagogue, in Dura Europos, which from the 3rd century Common Era in modern Syria, there's a very prominent panel that depicts really this whole story of Esther and tells it in a very telescoped way. So there you see, again, Mordecai riding on the horse that's being led by Haman, and in front of the Persian nobility who are waving and celebrating Haman. And then you have the king and the messenger, sort of all the important characters, and then Esther over there in her veil with her ladies, as in the Greek version. And really, in some ways, what you can see is this almost, to me, seems like sort of a curtain call. But the frontal posing, which is very typical of the sort of Persian art of this period, and Esther may well have been extra important to the Jews of what was then Persia in Dura, you see in an element, it sort of already has a sense of the story being staged in a way and reflecting conventions of performance. Now we're going to fast forward to the Middle Ages. And just note that Esther and Mordecai are often depicted as courtiers, and in terms of medieval Christian and Jewish art. So Esther and Mordecai give insight into the lives of non-Jewish royals and nobles. And furthermore, it was a way of understanding courtly intrigue, which again was an important part of navigating life, especially as sort of this intermediary class, this place that Jews held in medieval society, where they were often working with nobles, whether civic nobles, secular nobles such as kings and dukes and others, or clergy, bishops and cardinals and such. And the way it depicted the sort of the accrual and calling in of favors and the navigating of political tensions, where you could be simultaneously temporarily powerful but also quite vulnerable. So the Book of Esther spoke to medieval Jews in terms of the way it depicted precarious life, even in its moments of opulence. So I'll just note that Gersonides, writing in the 14th century, composed a manual for Jews in terms of modeling courtly behavior that was based on the Book of Esther, and that Jews also, as in that Targum where it talked about the negative things that non-Jews may say about Jews as a way of understanding anti-Semitism. And the illumination here I just like partly because it's it's perhaps one of the earlier depictions of a pretzel on a royal banquet table, but it is Esther and the king there. That's from a Christian manuscript. And what we can see in terms of performance is, again, in the illuminated prayer books, help us understand how Esther was visualized. And artists would have often, not only had their imaginations help them to understand how the Book of Esther might have been perceived, but also they would have drawn from parts of their daily life. So we see here this Northern Italian book, Maimonides' Book of Holidays from his Mishneh Torah, is the earliest depiction of Purim with full-fledged sort of costumes in a way that will become typical of Purim. And then we also see, again, the Aramaic poem referred to Haman as being crucified. And here we actually see in a Christian Bible the depiction of Haman as being crucified. That becomes a common understanding of the fate of Haman. And then we have depicted below sort of a synopsis in the Hebrew manuscript in Leipzig Machzor from the 14th century, another sort of depiction of Mordecai and Esther. It is in the Middle Ages that we begin to see what becomes known as the Purim Spiel, the Purim play, which the Yiddish name there, it's a German, so it tells that just the very name Purim Spiel tells us something about where in the Jewish diaspora it emerged. And it was probably emerging at the same time as the Fastnachtspiele in Germany, which is the plays and often sort of very vulgar performances that would take place just before the beginning of Lent, so essentially Mardi Gras. We know that the Purim Spiels were common by the 16th century. Again, sort of they're tracking right along with the Fastnachtspiele. The earliest text we have of an actual Purim Spiel is not until the 16th century, which intriguingly is authored by a Polish Jew living in Venice. So these Purim Spiels were originally poems, similar to what we saw with the Jewish Aramaic poem, actually, performed in a single voice, written in the vernacular. So again, that Aramaic poem that I shared about Zeresh, the wife of Haman, is sort of a forerunner of the Purim Spiel. These were originally primarily paraphrases of the Book of Esther with various expansions and embellishments. Sometimes they actually parodied elements of the sacred liturgy. So there could be a parody of a sermon, a parody of the prayer over wine, because it's the holiday that's associated with a great deal of wine consumption, as in the Book of Esther, where there are many banquets and much wine is consumed. It would often be performed in the home, but with costumes, and it was often bawdy and even judged obscene. So there are examples of communities attempting to ban their performances. This is the Jewish authorities attempting to prohibit Jews from having these festivities, and even the texts of a Purim Spiel being burned in Frankfurt in the 18th century. And they became ever more theatrical and even started to include more contemporary references, such as depicting a competition between cantors and other sorts of references to the community politics and things of the time. So they became a way of translating Esther into the contemporary scene. Again, something that we will see. And just to note here that the Purim spiel did continue, and here we have both pre-war in Eastern Europe and in Germany, pre-war children doing Purim spiels, and then also this last one, I found this image very arresting. It's in a DP camp, and you obviously see Haman being depicted as Hitler, and so they're really seeing that a more somber take on the idea that there will always be an enemy persecuting the Jews, but finding joy in the triumph of the Book of Esther. But I think it's quite the image of the Purim spiel from a DP camp after the war in Europe. So now we're going to go back in time a little bit to Italy, because Italy had a particularly intense love affair, we might say, with the Book of Esther. And one of the things we have there is from the 16th century, the text of one of these Purim spiels written in Judeo-Italian, the vernacular of the community. It was written within 50 years of the establishment of the first ghetto in Venice and the creation of the ghetto in Rome. And so we have there a community that's living with the experience of sort of damaging legal decrees and a sense of powerlessness, and even like Shushan, living in a walled city. At the same time, the poem was composed by a rabbi, Mordecai Dato, and he was, my connection is unstable. He was composing it for women who were themselves in some ways enclosed. And at the same time, they would probably have also known that there were many accomplished women in Italy at this time period, including, there's this little tiny prayer book. I don't think you can even see how the fingers are. It's probably about 2.5 inches tall, but it's famous. It's a prayer book that is very popular among my students because it changes the language of the morning prayer. The men would pray, "Thank you, God, who made me a man and not a woman." It's the most explicitly sort of misogynistic language that we see in the traditional prayer book. It's sort of there are ways of understanding that are less misogynist, but it's pretty straightforward. "Thank you, God, who made me a man and not a woman." Women traditionally would say, "Who made me in the divine image." But this prayer book from Italy has, "Thank you, God, who made me a woman and not a man." So it completely reverses it. And because this poem was written for the entertainment and edification of a group of elite Jewish women, it in many ways highlights parts of the Book of Esther that I think the author assumes they would have resonated with. So we see here just some opening lines where the poet speaking says, "Congregate women, each and every one, all those who do not have the doctrine of the sacred scripture and the holy words of the prophets. And the morning of Purim or some day prior, while you prepare your meals, come and in verse from beginning to end, I will tell you the story of Purim." So this is Mordecai Dato opening up his performance. Then we see again that the queen, the middle column I have here is an excerpt from where she's struggling with how weak she feels from fasting. And then finally, "In the morning at the hour to eat, came the king and Haman together to the palace to dine." I just like this detail. "I promise you," to his listeners, "I promise you it would be too much if I wish now to name all the foods that came to the table. And in any case, because I did not find myself there, I'm poorly informed of it." So you can see, and here we have Renaissance period copy of the Book of Esther with the banquet scene laid out. But you can imagine again, sort of the way he's speaking to his listeners, the way Dato is speaking to his listeners and drawing them into imagining the scene and amplifying the parts of the story that they would resonate with. And here are just some more beautiful scrolls, including one that was just recently acquired by the National Library in Israel, the little one that's attached to the rod with the flowers up the side, that was, we know from a colophon, was written by a young girl named Luna Amram in the 18th century when she was 14 years old. So that's just, but we have many, many early Italian Renaissance and early modern illuminated versions of the Megillah. Finally, we come to the Old Tale in a New World. Esther comes to America. She arrived with the first Jews, and in fact, the Sephardic Jews were particularly enamored of Esther, as with many of the Italian Jews. They resonated with the fact that she had to conceal her identity while remaining faithful, that Esther she cannot tell the king that she is a Jew until she reveals herself at the banquet when saying that Haman was going to kill her family and her people, and the experience of navigating and even thriving in a hostile world. There's a strong influence of the Caribbean carnival customs in the way that Purim would have been celebrated. And it spread from Sephardic Jews in many ways to the Ashkenazi Jews, that the Sephardim, the Jews of the Spanish diaspora, were sort of cultural elites, and the Ashkenazim were more numerous, but finding the Sephardim sort of paved a way for them to make their way in this peculiar new world that they were in. And here I just have the American Purim Carnival. And so from the 18th century, early 20th century, and present day. And I just note that Purim was a way in which the Jews displayed their comfort entering the high society, we could say the court of American society, in that they began to have Purim balls as charity fundraisers, as even before the Civil War. So the first one, actually, I guess right around the time, 1860. And the Mayor Isaacs says that Purim should be selected as the occasion of a good fancy dress ball, the proceeds to be donated to charity. And so he organized these, and they were fundraisers, and they were attended by both Jews and non-Jews, and invitations were highly sought after. But at the same time, they were sometimes controversial. And here, just because I happen to be physically in North Carolina, we have evidence of these Purim balls, these Purim galas being, making certain rabbinic authorities uneasy. So, and the rabbis were probably justified in being a little bit uneasy about them. Like the little image that says Merry Purim. Wilmington's Concordia Society Purim Ball in 1889 featured an elegant but very, very traif dinner. In 1885, there was a Purim Carnival held in Goldsboro that featured children enacting the traditional story of Queen Vashti and Esther and Ahasuerus. But 3 years later, they were performing a play called A Kiss in the Dark, which does not sound quite the same and certainly not canonical. And so we see sort of the secularization, as it were, of the holiday of Purim. And at the same time, in the most recent period, we actually see that the story of Esther is no longer just for Jews. We see she becomes a very popular sort of girl power vacation Bible school curriculum and similar type things. And we'll see a little bit of this when we get to the next topic I have, which is film. But I would note that the embrace of Esther among Christians in very recent years is quite new among certain, I should say, Protestants, because you have a long history of Esther being described as too Jewish, and in many ways that's also actually sort of cover language for too Catholic. So Martin Luther in the 16th century famously said, "I am so hostile to this book, Second Maccabees, and Esther, that I wish they did not exist at all, for they Judaize too greatly and contain much pagan naughtiness." He also said at one point that he wished he could cast it into the Elbe River. And then much more recently, just about 100 years ago, in a textbook on introduction to the Old Testament, we find the statement that all the worst and most unpleasing features of Judaism are here displayed without disguise, and only in Alexandria was it felt absolutely necessary to cover up the ugliest bare places with few religious patches. And there it is giving sort of a veiled, a damning with faint praise, the Greek version. So sorry for my little typo there. And to conclude this very rapid story, I've chosen a few movie adaptations because, in fact, Esther is such an inherently dramatic story, even in biblical source material, that people have been long tempted to adapt it to not just the stage, but to the screen, large and small. And so we see here first 1960, a film based on the Book of Esther called Esther and the King, and starring Joan Collins as Esther. You can stream it for free on YouTube. I'm not sure I recommend that. But it's part of the same period in time when David Bathsheba, Quo Vadis, the Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur, when there's sort of these big sword and sandals type Bible epics. And what's interesting is how we see their Hollywood making Esther as they wish it were in many ways. So Ahasuerus, instead of being a buffoon, is sober, noble, and virtuous. Vashti is having an affair with Haman and deserves everything that she gets. Esther, there's a love triangle so that they can have a sword fight because she apparently had a fiance named Simon and he gets in a fight with Ahasuerus. But Esther does love the king, as you can see in that movie poster. And it's really translating Esther into a very late 50s, early 60s sort of conformist Judeo-Christian fairy tale. And there's even a striking point where Esther supports a progressive tax policy over Haman's flat tax. So she's really got a very good head on her shoulders in terms of governmental policy. At the same time, the entire thing is stripped of all the humor that I think makes the Hebrew version in particular so endearing to many generations. And it's also notably a very pro-law. Law is sort of the source of stability and security in the film, whereas law is in some ways sort of topsy-turvy in the Hebrew original. And it gets really not a very good review in the New York Times there. Then in Israel, 27 years later, we have Amos Gitai's directorial debut. If you know Gitai, you probably know him for the film Kadosh. The dialogue of this film is almost entirely from the Hebrew of the Book of Esther, which is really fascinating and makes it a great teaching tool for biblical Hebrew classes because they can really follow along. But that means that he also has to confront more directly the uncomfortable violence of the final chapters. And Gitai uses the violence of the text, the part that the other versions, we'll see the American versions, are most eager to sort of smooth over, as a way of speaking to the cyclical nature of brutality and revenge in his contemporary Middle East. And it is filmed in ruin, so there are occasionally these scenes with like burning tires and other sorts of anachronisms, we could say, and it really intentional juxtaposition of beauty and ruins. And so as the New York Times Review says, the sense of ancient unsettled scores that have simmered for centuries is almost palpable in this beautiful but ravaged territory. The juxtaposition suggests how overwhelmingly the region's history continues to haunt Israel's presence. So the Israeli version is a much more sober version, and he's really turned Esther into a commentary on Israeli-Palestinian politics. Back to the US in the year 2000, when I was in Chicago for graduate school, I remember watching this whole thing, fascinating. There was a mini-series based on Bible stories, and one of them was on Esther, and it's a very Hallmark Channel kind of production, and it really very much reflects what I would call sort of a Sunday school smoothing, sanitizing version of the story. It has cameos in the film by Ezra and Nehemiah, other biblical figures from other books of the Hebrew Bible, who are encouraging everyone to return to the land of Israel. So it has sort of a soft Christian Zionism to it. And again, reflects sort of that sort of a Protestant, almost Christian Zionist nostalgia for the books of the Hebrew Bible. And finally, there's perhaps my favorite movie adaptation of the Book of Esther, which is called One Night with the King. I'm not actually sure. The Princess of Persia poster may be the best poster for the movie that I've ever seen, although she does not handle swords or knives at any point in the movie that I can remember, but that's sort of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer version of Queen Esther. But yeah, so I say pious, political, perfect girl power because it reflects from 2006. And it's really quite the product of its time. So the king's search for a new bride has distinct overtones of The Bachelor, which again, there are parts of it that were funny, that were not intended to be funny. And Esther is really essentially a Disney princess in this movie. She's kind, nice, she likes to read, she loves her goofy uncle. She teaches the girls of the harem to read, and they all love literature. She rejects all the luxuries and things of the Persian harem, favors modest clothing, minimal jewels. She's a natural and ivory girl. Ahasuerus, the king, is a Disney Prince Charming, and he often has his shirt off, which is an interesting detail. it has sort of a Christian Zionist overtone. The Jews often are, including Esther, who is always referred to as Hadassah by her family, the Hebrew name that she has when she's first introduced in the book, of wanting to return to the Holy Land. She at one point says, "I want to dance in the streets of Jerusalem like King David did." And perhaps most disturbingly, it actually maps a very post 9/11 geopolitics onto the story, and that the Jews and the Greeks are conspiring to bring democracy to Persia, for which Haman cannot stand. And Haman is depicted in explicitly sort of neo-Nazi overtones in terms of his logo and his there's a pageant that he, big rally that he has, which is distinctly modeled on sort of Nazi rallies. So, but yes, in the post 9/11 world, Jews and Greeks, that is the West, want to bring democracy to Persia, that is the Middle East, and Haman is what stands in their way. So, an interesting message there. And by way of concluding, I'm happy to go back and revisit any of these scenes. That I just say that Vashti, that Esther, the Book of Esther, continues to speak to every generation. And I know a number of rabbis who are planning on dressing up as Queen Vashti and talking about consent. And also at the same time, the idea of sort of refugees and flight and other parts of the Book of Esther speak to many others today, so that the story belongs to every generation, wherever and however it is told. So we have a number of interpretations that it'll be just on Wednesday night and Thursday. Communities will still continue this tradition of taking this dramatic story, this very funny story, this very sometimes disturbing story, and finding ways to own it. So with that, I wrap up my fast talking presentation.
Well, thank you so much for this for this journey that you've taken us through time and space with the Book of Esther, and how it seems to resonate at different generations and interacting with the various cultures that, of course, Jews found themselves. We have time for questions and comments. So please submit any questions you have. I wanted to make an apology and a correction when I was introducing you. I think I introduced you saying that you received your doctorate at the University of Minnesota, which we would be very proud to claim you receiving your doctorate here, but you in fact received your doctorate from the University of Chicago. So I did want to make that correction. Yeah, are there any questions from the participants? I have maybe to start things up, and maybe a larger question. You mentioned that, well, first of all, some of your images, you represented, in artists and Renaissance and non-Jewish artists sort of depicting the story. And you mentioned also how, the Protestants sort of embrace the story. So I'm wondering, since clearly in your presentation, different, the Jews were informed sort of by their surrounding cultures. So it wasn't necessarily they were informed about the Book of Esther itself, but rather, there were different ways of performance and culture and that kind of thing. But I'm wondering about the Book of Esther itself, and how, Christians, or even before Christian times, if there was sort of a, sort of how the Book of Esther may have also interacted, if we know that in any way, with Jewish communities and the way Jews have, represented. I think in very modern times it seems more obvious. But I'm wondering about earlier times as well.
I think there's a long tradition of the Purim spiel being fairly polemical in terms of, and you can see that even in that image from pre-war Poland, a number of the kids were dressed up like Catholic clergy as part of their Purim spiel costumes. And you see, I'm really struck by the Christian depiction from that Dutch Bible of the 16th century that shows Haman being crucified. Because that seems like something that comes out of, it's a common trope in Jewish tradition, because Haman is a lineage of, he's a villain, like Jesus is a villain in a number of Purim poems. And the Book of Esther in a way is of a piece with, it's like the mock gospel of Toldot Yeshu and things. But I think at the same time, one of the things that we see that's interesting, like is as Jews become more emancipated, in terms of Europe and in the US, there's a lot of uneasiness about that. So the Purim balls from like the 19th and 19th century in particular, those were charitable affairs that raised money for orphans, and non-Jews would go and talk about what a wonderful time they had at the Hebrew party. I think in the Middle Ages it was more a chance, in a way like Mardi Gras, for people to as a valve that let the pressure out on Jewish relations, and often coincides roughly with the time of Mardi Gras, which is a time for disempowered populations to express themselves with less fear of punishment. But at the same time, I think Jews often did keep inside some of their more transgressive behaviors, because it's one thing but it just in a way adds to the suspicion. I think we do have evidence of Christian anxiety about what Jews were doing behind closed doors. So that the tension between when I think that's why Luther refers to, the heathen naughtiness of the celebrations.
Yeah, so there's a question that kind of reverses my question from Anne Monique Rappaport. Is there evidence of influence of Purim on Carnival? Or I guess we could sort of maybe expand that question a little bit on, sort of what was, the sort of the carnivalesque aspect of kind of performing Purim and celebrations. Clearly there was the other way around, we can see for sure, but what about Purim's influence on the surrounding culture or performance of carnival or other types of performance and celebration? I guess
I think you do. In general, I find it's very hard to sort of say directly that the influence moves just sort of in one direction. I think you often see, you get a sense that someone had an idea for something that was, in this case, particularly fun, and particularly fun and festive, and the timing, such that with Purim and Lent, I think, and even like the idea that Purim may originally have been connected to the Persian New Year, which itself has sort of distinctive, festive celebration, that it's a period of time. Again, it's that pivot to when, to the spring, and, the days getting longer and the weather getting better. I think that it's a natural time, and that's why we see Carnival, we see Fastnacht in Germany. Purim, becomes amplified. I think that that it was reflecting a sort of more diffuse kind of mood, and that I think every year people would sort of like borrow ideas from each other depending on whose holiday came first on the calendar almost. You can imagine these ideas, but I do think that there's, the way that, that Jews in sort of the Portuguese colonies, like in Curacao, that would have been different from how, and the same way that Mardi Gras and things would have been different there, that Jews are always going to be sort of in tension, between wanting to sort of, they're aware of what the non-Jews are doing, and the non-Jews are aware of what the Jews are doing, and there's always a twin tensions that you want to sort of like be normal and be like, sort of have as much fun as the others, but also desire to be sort of see yourself as being distinctive. So I think there's this sort of a push me, pull you dynamic to the cultural influence question.
Couple of questions. One is asking when it was first written. So I suppose when scholars think that in biblical, maybe what scholars think about when the Book of Esther may have been written. And there's an interesting note that you might want to comment on that says that Dante represents Haman as crucified in Purgatorio 17, apparently deriving from the Vulgate's use of crux in its translation of Esther. So you might be able to comment on that as well.
I mean, in terms of the last portion, exactly how Haman dies is a subject. I mean, you can see even a couple of different in the visual art. There's the question of whether he is, because we think of hanging as being by the neck, and you certainly some of the images like from the Leipzig Machzor have hung by they're all hanging by their necks. But then there's a very strong, I think in context in the Persian, it's probably more likely impaled, which is like Vlad the Impaler, it was just, which is a even more disturbing image. And then crucifixion, reflecting, again, sort of that idea of translating the death penalties that were into that Roman context. And again, sort of like the fact that Haman's crime is essentially a form of insurrection. So I think that idea that it's the crucifixion, and what's interesting with that, that spreads beyond. In late antiquity, we see that very clearly in terms of the Jewish understandings. There's a poem where a much longer poem in Jewish Aramaic where Haman is talking to all the different villains who have afflicted Israel over the centuries and complaining to all of them about how his fate is worse, and he has a big argument. It culminates in a sort of an argument with Jesus. But so it's again that sort of that parody of the Christian sacred history in the context of Purim, and they're comparing each other as having been crucified. So I think so to see Haman, who is mocked and whose name is to be erased, as sort of a forerunner of the Christian Savior, is a way of I have one friend from graduate school who referred to Esther as just a Jewish revenge fantasy. That it just took all that anger and bitterness and mixed it with sort of this very sort of dark humor, and out came Purim. And in terms of when it was written, I think it's usually understood to be. There's a lot of discussion. It's obviously written in Hebrew. The Book of Esther is written in Hebrew. It has some Persian words in it. So it's either from, and given the setting and in the Persian period, it can't be too early. So it's a question, and it in many ways it participates, and Professor Aaron Kroll may have more to say on this, but that it reflects the conventions of sort of the Hellenistic novels about Persians. That there is that the Greek-speaking communities had a lot of stereotypes, and Herodotus writes a lot about the Persians as being sort of these people who you have to pass a law twice, once when you're drunk and once when you're sober. It's sort of like a referendum system. It has to make sense in both situations. And the Persians are sort of the exotic other. It's a form of Orientalism going back quite far. And that the fantasy nature of the depictions of court life, it's clearly not an historical work of sort of history. But it's sort of using this fairy tale setting of Persia. So it's probably written more in the West rather than in the East, but not sort of so far into the Hellenized world that it was in Greek. That didn't come until later.
Okay, well, I have maybe one final quick question while we wind this up for the evening, and that is not necessarily only this lecture or story, but the kinds of questions you raise. Are these going to be a part of your future publication? I think you raise so many really fascinating interests about how this the Book of Esther migrates through time and how it's performed. And so I'm wondering how this kind of fits into some of the research you're doing and plans of writing and publication in the near future.
The part that gets closest to what I'm working on now is that section from Late Antiquity, because that's really where I do most of my work. But I always pay attention to the modern context, so especially the films and things, because that's the world I live in. And I like to think of, in antiquity, people also wanted to be, they wanted to be entertained, and they had ideas of what was entertaining and how you sort of could update traditional stories to suit your own purpose. So I think in some ways, I think of these Piyyutim, the liturgical poems, as being the popular entertainment of their day. And in particular, reading the liturgical poems and like that image from Dura, the image, and other sort of Jewish and non-Jewish art that seems to depict how people visually would have understood entertainment, and in terms of theater and depictions of costumes and how you tell stories sort of in these multimedia ways. Because to imagine hearing the Book of Esther and then you have these visuals that tell you sort of like what the characters looked like, or if you are accustomed to seeing staged plays, I think that to have, in the same way that we know that orators studied the techniques of actors and knew how to deliver emotional ways. That's, I think, when I imagine Book of Esther in the original, or certainly these poems, like in Zeresh's voice, how they would have actually been performed is part of what I find very. We know from the church fathers and the rabbis that Jews, Christians, and pagans alike all went to the shows and enjoyed a good performance. And I think, and the religious institutions wanted to compete with that, or they had to compete with that, because you want people coming to hear you as well. So you have to lure them in with a good show.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. I hope that we can see some of you again tomorrow for what I'm sure will be another fascinating talk. And yeah, thank you all for coming this evening. And yeah, have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming.
Okay.